My name is Dan Grove. I play the violin. I also minored in piano and in voice in college. My main instrument, though, has been violin. I grew up in Winfield, Kansas, which is not far from here. I was born into a family of seven, and it was a musical family. My mom was the main musician. She sang, and she told the five of us kids, she said, okay, you're going to start on piano, and what's going to be your second instrument? And it wasn't whether there was going to be a second instrument, it was what is it going to be? So that's how we grew up. My mom was a choir director at church. We sang in children's choirs under her, so we were under her thumb most of the time. Our family grew up, uh, we all studied piano with Grace Sellers, who taught there at Southwestern College. And as far as I was concerned, I decided that I was going to play on the violin because my dad had played the violin and they still had the violin at home. So I started out on the violin, started on piano in the third grade, went to added violin in the fourth grade and took that through junior high school. Later on, added pipe organ, as well as my sister played pipe organ. And so it was natural in our family. We all played, and there was always music being made at home. My dad's violin was, of course, a full-size violin, and I was a third grader, and I was small for third grade. I was the smallest kid in my class, and so I had this huge violin, and I couldn't reach as far as I needed to reach. And so what I would do is I would just put the violin over, hook it there on the music stand, and it would help hold it up for me. And uh, and I just had to get along with it because I had a full-size violin, full-size bow. So it didn't really occur to me that it was strange or anything, but I did have to learn to cope with it, and it never presented any great problems that I could see. During our period of growing up in the public schools there were music contests every year sponsored by the schools. And so starting in seventh grade, I was playing in music contests all the way through high school. And about 4 years that I had been playing in that local contest every year, the judge who came to hear us play was a cello professor at Kansas State University. And it was about my sophomore year, I believe it was, when I played and for the contest again. And he took my mother aside because she happened to be in the room after the competition was over. And he says, it's too bad that you have a son as talented as you do and he has to play on a piece of junk like that. So she went home and talked to my dad, and they decided that they were going to get me a violin. So what happened is they contacted the music store there in Winfield, and they had contact with the store in Chicago called Lewis and Son. And at that time, Lewis and Son was one of the biggest string companies in the United States of America. So that's where my violin came from, because they ordered three. They sent three in the mail. I tried them out for a couple of weeks or so and decided I want this one in particular, and it's still the one I play on now. It was made in France, in Paris. And so they sent two of them back, sent two more for me to try out, and I stuck with the French one, and that's the one I decided to stay with. And that violin and the bow have been with me from coast to coast and around the world and back. Okay, this is the violin that I was mentioning a while ago that my parents bought for me when I was about a sophomore in high school. It was made in Paris, France, they think around 1835. They're not sure exactly the exact date. And the bow is also a French bow. And since getting these, I've never had another violin other than this one. I'm going to play a few notes, it won't be very much. a piece by Massenet called Meditation from the opera Thais. I was introduced to the idea of going to Europe by a conductor from Romania who happened to have been in Wichita when I came back after having my first job in Massachusetts. Came back to Kansas. He was the conductor of the university orchestra at that time, and things didn't work out. I'll just put it that way. I did not stay to do my master's degree there. I stayed there for about a summer and a semester, and he said, I'm going to suggest that you go to Germany, and he says that you will have opportunities there as a violinist. And so I took him up on his wife happened to have been German, could write German letters for me to request times for auditions. So all that was set up before we ever went, and by the time we went, I was married. I had gotten married to an opera singer. So we sold everything and moved to Germany. And I was, almost as soon as I got there, I found out about an orchestra that was in Munich, and that's where we were staying at the time. So I went and auditioned for the conductor, and he says, yes, we need you. I said, oh, good. I'll just settle here. And so I didn't take any of the other auditions that had been arranged. And the orchestra I played in was a classical orchestra. And it would happen to be the only orchestra in Germany that was not state supported, which is quite extraordinary, really. But that's the way it was, and that's the way it stayed. But the orchestra that I was in did not play just classical music. We did a lot of pop stuff. We did a lot of recording for radio and television commercials. And we would be in the recording studio for hours on end. Some of the things that we did in that orchestra that were not classically involved, I remember we did a performance with Andy Williams, who was a pop singer. I don't think he's probably living anymore, but he was a wonderful baritone, as I recall. Andy Williams, we did, there was another pop singer, his name was Barry White, who was black, and he weighed about 250 pounds, so he was huge. And our orchestra went on tour with him in his trio of 3 black singers. Of course, all women, and all in their finery. And so the trio would have the first half of the concert, and then Barry would come on and play the piano and sing, and the orchestra, the strings of our orchestra played along with them, and we were called Love Unlimited. So that was extraordinary. It took us to Munich or to Berlin. There were a number of other things that we did there in Munich. There was a place called the Deutsches Theater, which is the German theater, and we did several things in there, one of which was a run of My Fair Lady in German, and the run went for about 3 months, so we were playing every night in the theater there for My Fair Lady, which was I never got tired of playing the music. You'd think after 3 or 4 times, but no, it was. I never got tired of the music. So another thing that our orchestra did was substituted for other orchestras when they were on vacation, and that usually entailed playing ballet. So there was one performance that we gave in the Bavarian State Opera House again, when the Bolshoi Ballet from Moscow was in town. And guess who played for them? Our orchestra played for the Bolshoi Ballet. And another ballet festival that we did, there were a number of solo ballet dancers who partook in this concert, and one of them happened to have been the greatest ballerina that Britain has ever produced. Her name has to be Dame Margot Fonteyn. So we did the performance with Margot Fonteyn. Another one that we did that was classical, we ended up going to Bonn, which at that point was capital of Germany. And we were asked to come and play for a NATO convention. And so that's what we did, and what we ended up performing was, it was a Brahms piano concerto, if you can believe that or not. They choreographed a Brahms piano concerto that we played for the NATO convention. And one of the most vivid memories I have of that time was with the guest conductor who was conducting in the Bayerische Staatsoper, which means the Bavarian State Opera, which is in the National Theater, which is one of the greatest opera houses in the world. And our orchestra was playing some sort of a festival at that time, and I was able to play an opera under the baton of Carlos Kleiber, who, according to professional musicians, is probably the best conductor who has ever lived. And that's not an exaggeration. So that's been one of the top experiences that I have had in Europe. At the end of the 8th year, I went to England, as it turned out, for a couple of years, and I was introduced to a violin player who had worked under a man named Shinichi Suzuki, who invented or came up with the Suzuki method of playing the violin, or teaching the violin. And so I was apprenticed under this woman for a couple of years there in England. I became concertmaster of the Longmont Symphony, and I was with them for 13 years. And then that came to an end, and I got a request from the fellow who was going to be conducting the Loveland Symphony if I would be interested in being the concertmaster there. And I said, of course. So I went and played with the Loveland Orchestra as their concertmaster for about another 15 years. And then what happened, just to make it conclusive, there was a big flood that hit Boulder County, and it affected me, and I had to get out of my apartment, and it was nothing but problems from there on. And finally I decided this is not going to work out, and so that's when I decided I would move back to Kansas. So I started playing in the Newton Mid-Kansas Symphony Orchestra, and I found out that Hutchinson did have a community orchestra. And so I called the conductor, his name is Kashgarian, and I called him and asked if he needed any violin players, and he said yes, he did. And so that's how I happen to be playing in the Hutchinson Symphony. So one of the crowning points, I guess I would say, in my career as a musician occurred when I was still in college. And the conductor, I mentioned his name a while ago, his name was James Robertson, held an annual competition called the Concerto Aria Concert that we students there at the and I was going to Wichita State University at the time, and I was interested in performing a certain piece that I was working on. And the piece was by a composer named Chanson, and the name of the piece was Poème, and I played the solo part with the University Orchestra. So it was the University Orchestra was all students. All the soloists on the program were students. All the conductors for those performances were students as well. And I played the Chanson Poème, and to sort of build up to that, I happened to have the opportunity. It was an Easter break when I was about a sophomore in college, and I went and performed for a violin teacher at Oberlin Conservatory. His name was Stuart Cannon, and he coached me on this piece that I was working on, this French piece. And I worked with him on that for about 2 hours, came back to Kansas, finished preparing for the program, gave the performance, and they gave me a standing ovation, which was pretty cool, I thought. So that was one. Another one, the year that I was living in Los Angeles, I was playing in with a bunch of musicians who just did not have jobs at the time as musicians, and an orchestra had formed, and the conductor asked me if I would want to do the Beethoven violin concerto with them. I said, yes, I would, and so I did that, and they recorded it for some cable TV thing. So that was a peak for me. Okay, with me as a performing musician, it's important that I stay in shape. And the only way you can stay in shape is to keep playing, and hopefully with a good orchestra. And so I'm now retired. I have at this point no students. There was one I taught a few weeks ago, but at this point I don't have any students right now. And I have formed a friendship with another violinist who happens to live in McPherson. So we've been getting together every week or two, playing duets, and I play not only violin with him, but also sometimes viola. So this has kept us going in this time of no orchestra. But the time is going to come that the orchestras will start back up, and they are working at that very thing right now, at this very moment. And it is important, in my opinion, for a person to maintain friendships with other people. And this is one venue for a musician, if you're an orchestral musician, for you to form a number of friendships. And these are friendships that last like forever, as far as we're concerned. One example is I have a good friend who now is living in California. We got acquainted when we were living in Germany. She was an opera singer. She and her husband were both opera singers. And we have stayed in touch over all these years. And she's divorced, I've divorced, everything's changed in our personal lives, but we still have the music that we hold on to. And so this is one thing that is important, that I continue to be active. And I would recommend it to anybody.